Now we'll talk about how to utilize permissions and how to authorize against those permissions in Orchard Core from code. Remember, in previous sessions we have seen how you can configure permissions. Well, first of all, what kind of built-in permissions are in there for Orchard. We have also taken a brief look at which permissions are more or less general and which permissions are related to content management. What we'll do now is that we'll utilize the knowledge that we already have, and we will do some authorization from code. In the next section, we'll also write our own custom permission. So let's see. Let's get back to our module that we have already, and let's create a simple admin controller first, and that will be some very basic authorization. Because if you want to provide administration features for your module, the easiest way to do that is to create an admin controller. An admin controller is, well, a controller which is named admin controller. And we'll see what makes it special in a second. So, admin controller, which will be a standard MVC controller. The only difference is that it's conventionally named admin controller. So, let's use the controller snippet again. And let's add some kind of action here. Again, we'll just use some kind of string returning action. So we just need to see whether it works at all, and nothing else yet. All right. So that's it. Let me start the application and let's see what happens. Because an admin controller is a conventionally named controller in Orchard. It, of course, represents a controller which serves some administrative purposes. The controller, the actions of which are accessed from the admin area. And that also means that it provides some authorization out of the box implicitly without you doing anything in particular. So the application is starting. Let's go over to the browser. Now, there is actually two ways to utilize admin controllers in Orchard Core. First, you can do just what we did. You can name your controller admin controller. And there is actually another way, and that's by using an attribute called admin. I will also show you that in a minute. Well, we are here in Dojo Course.module and admin controller. So again, we can use the standard MVC route patterns, but because this is an admin controller, we can actually use something else and start with admin instead, and then our module name, and then the action name. Well, we got not found because we don't have the permission, but let me log in to the admin, and let's see what happens then. Again, we will use admin password, 1 exclamation mark, the usual password and credentials. And now that we have it, so the site is now loaded. Let's access our controller. And again, we'll use the standard MVC pattern. We'll need to start with Dojo Course.module and then admin controller and then index. So slash the module name slash the controller name and slash index. Although again, we could use attribute routing to make a nicer route. And you can see that we go to the login page. So we couldn't access that action because we were authorized against some basic permissions, and because of that, authentication is also needed. And that was handled automatically by Orchard for us. So let's also log in with admin password1 exclamation mark. You know the drill. And now we are back to our controller. And as I said, naming an admin controller, just admin controller, is a convention. Of course, if you have a single controller where you want to provide administrative features to your users, then that is enough and you don't have to complicate it. If you want to have multiple such admin controllers, then of course you need to name them somehow else than admin controller. And if you do that, then add the attribute called admin here. You don't need that for a controller named admin controller, as I'm just adding that as an example. You just need to use it for controllers which are named differently than admin controller. All right, that was some very rudimentary authorization. And actually what authorized against was one of the permissions we have already seen. So let me go there to the admin and let's quickly check out what that permission is. And yeah, let's for example take a look at the administrator role, because administrator role of course has everything. And there is this access admin panel permission that we have seen a few sessions ago. This is the permission that Orchid authorized against, and since you need to be at least you need to be authenticated user for it, and I think at least an editor or a moderator kind of user for it, well, it redirected us to the login page. All right, so that's all good, and sometimes this is pretty much just you need. Sometimes you also need a bit more authorization, a bit more fine-grained authorization. And what you can do, of course, is that you can also authorize against all of these permissions specifically. So, for example, you can also create your own permissions, which we'll do, or you can also authorize against other modules' built-in permissions. One particular set of permissions which are very commonly authorized against from custom modules, because usually you wouldn't really touch other modules' permissions, because why would you? But content permissions is something that you usually still authorize against from custom extensions. And we are talking about these permissions in particular. So everything related to content management, content items, editing, deleting, publishing, content, whatever. You see a lot of permissions here. So let's also do some authorization here. So let me go back to our controller, and I will create a new action here. This will need to be an async one, because we'll use some async services. And let's create a string returning action again, just for simplicity. If you want to see more complex examples, again, please refer to the training demo module. So let's call this something like content authorization. Authorization. All right, and let's also return a string here, but this string will actually contain our authorization status. I will add that starting now. So how does content authorization work? Well, you always need a content item. Well, not always. You can also generally authorize against these content permissions. So you can also say that I want to authorize the current user against the edit content permission. I want to check whether they have this base edit content permission at all. And that's sometimes good. Usually what you need is really authorizing the current user against a specific content item. So you don't just want to check whether they have edit content permission at all. You want to check whether they can edit that specific content item. Because, you know, permission management can get quite complex. Authorization can get really complex because we have all the permissions here, but you can also write your own code that will extend permission management by hooking into the ASP.NET Core authorization pipeline. And you can also dynamically determine whether a specific content item is accessible for a given user. So on top of all the permissions that we have here, you can write your custom logic that determines that, all right, this current user, can they actually access, can they actually edit or view or delete the current content item? Even though they might have the edit content permission, you can still override that and say that, okay, based on whatever rules I decide, they still can't edit it. So long story short, what you want to do always is that you want to authorize users against permissions. And when we are talking about content management, then also against specific content items. So that's also important. Usually it's not good to just check for the user's role or roles. That's usually not really enough, and that's kind of something that would defeat role-based access control or the flexibility and configurability of role-based access control, always authorizing as permissions. So that's clear now, I hope. So let's go back to our controller and let's do some authorization code. As I said, we'll authorize against the content item. So first we need a content item. Now, previously in our person controller, we have seen how to fetch content items, person pages in this case here. And we have also briefly used Content Manager, the IAuthorizationService service, to also initialize those content item documents that we have fetched from the database. What we'll do now is that we'll again use the IAuthorizationService service, but this time we will use it to create content item objects. We will create a person page content item object on the fly here. We won't persist it. We won't deal with that. Again, please refer to the training demo for more examples. We will just create a content item quickly so we can authorize against that content item, and thus we will be able to check whether the current user can edit or do something with person page content items, or rather that specific person page content item object. Now, let's go back to the controller then, and let's inject IAuthorizationManager. And you may notice that I'm still using our Visual Studio extension, the Lombiq Visual Studio extension, to inject dependencies with its dependency injector feature. Now we have a content manager, so now we can also create a person page object. So let's create a person page here, and with content manager new async, we can create a person page like this. Well, first of all, this is an async call, so I will need to add await here. And secondly, do note that I'm using the name of the content type that I've also used here in the migration class when creating the content type. So still person page as before. So now we have a newly created person page content item. As said, this is not yet persisted. This is just a newly created object, hence the name new async. So it's really like the new operator. And actually there is also a create async method that you would use to actually persist a newly created content item object. But we won't do that now. And now that we have this person page object, we can do some authorization. And authorization we do with a service called IAuthorizationService. So let's go again here and inject the dependency. It's not IAuthorizer, that's in Orchard 1. but IAuthorizationService in singular. Yeah, as you can see from the namespace of this, this is actually not an Orchard service. This is an ASP.NET Core service which Orchard implements. So, as we have seen before, Orchard is not something that would swap out what's built into ASP.NET Core. It builds on top of ASP.NET Core. It utilizes ASP.NET Core's authorization and everything. It provides role-based access control that you can manage from the admin, but it provides it within the ASP.NET Core authorization pipeline. Now that we have this service injected, let's also do some authorization. And this is where I will actually return the authorization state here. So let's do the actual authorization now with authorization service. And just so it's a bit readable, I will create a variable for it here. And we have authorization service. And of course, we'll use this AuthorizeAsync method. And as you can see, there are a lot of overloads here. And Orchard also provides a few extensions that we don't yet see all of them here. At first, it can be a bit daunting, but we need to do the following. First, we'll need to supply the actual user to AuthorizeAsync. And since we are in a controller, the current user is also already available in a property. And secondly, we need to supply a permission. And the permission that we'll use will be, of course, a content permission. And let's do the edit content permission. And we have a class called common permissions, where these permissions are defined. And if we take a closer look at this, you'll see that although this comes from the Orchard Core.contents namespace, it actually comes from the Orchard Core.contents.core project or package. This is so if you want to use these basic services, this very commonly used, these basic services and basic permissions, and also these very commonly used permissions here, has the name common permissions, then you don't need to take a dependency on the contents module. If you want to roll out your own content management features, you can do that without doing too much to override what's in the contents module, but you can completely swap out the contents module, and the rest of the system, since everybody authorizes against these common permissions, will still work. So we'll authorize against edit content here. And the third parameter, the third parameter will need to be the actual content item, as we have discussed. So person page here. And this is an async method call, so we'll need to await it. And there is a bit of an issue here. That we don't have a proper overload, and IntelliSense won't find it either. The issue is that we'll need to use an extension method from the infrastructure, from the Orchard Core infrastructure project. So let me quickly add the Orchard Core infrastructure package here. Structure, yes. And once it's found on NuGet, great. Same version again. Yeah, we'll need to do a bit of administration. And now, once it loads, we will get this nice extension method. So now, this isAuthorize should indicate, this is a Boolean, it should indicate whether the current user is authorized to edit this person page content item. Let me do a bit of formatting here, so it's better readable, and let's return this authorization flag. So let me use string interpolation here. And let's call it like this. Is authorized. Sorry. And is authorized. All right. Let's now go back to the browser and let's reload our page here. Currently, we are logged in with the administrator user. This is pretty much like God mode in games. This user has all the permissions, so we accept this to just work. What we can do though is that we can log out and we can see whether an anonymous user has any permissions. Nothing yet. Apparently, it didn't compile. So let me go to let me go back to Visual Studio. Oh, I used the wrong action. So let's start the application again, and this is the content authorization action that we have to access here. So admin/content authorization. But we get a not found here. And there is a bit of a particularity with AdminControllers. I'm not entirely sure about the reasons, is that once you start having these actions, you will actually need to prefix the whole thing with admin2. So /admin, module name, /admin again, and content authorization. Starting the route with /admin is also a convention that everything is under the admin area. And I'm not sure why it worked for the index method otherwise. But here we see that indeed the admin user is authorized. Now if we log out, we'll probably get a reference exception, or if not, we will get a false here. Well, we get an authorization prompt. So the authorization actually worked. We get an authorization prompt because we are in an admin controller. But it would be also nice to actually see what happens with a standard user or a non-super user. So let me go back to the admin and let me create a user that will be able to access the admin area, but won't be able to authorize or won't be authorized to edit person pages. So let's go to security, and we don't yet have another user, so let's create another user, and let's call that restricted. Email, well, restricted at example. It happens. Example.com, and let's call it, or let's use the contributor role. All right, and now let's also take a look at that role, and let's see what it can do. For person pages, we don't yet have any permissions. So actually, unticking this edit on content, probably this edit content for others will be already sufficient. It would mean that this user can't edit person pages. But let's make sure and let's make person pages secureable. And of course, let's also check whether this user can access the admin panel to begin with, and they can, so that's good. But let's go to the person page content type, and let's make it secureable, so we can actually specify permissions for it. So, all right, here we are. Now it is secureable, and now if we go back, we should be able to see a lot of person page permissions. Yeah, as you can see, nothing here. And that's good. That's what we want. Person page shouldn't be editable by the contributor role. So let's log off here, and let's log in here with the restricted user. Oh, we didn't set the password for the user, so let's go back to the admin page, and let's log in with our standard admin user, and let's set the password. What we'll use will be the same password 1 exclamation mark and then password 1 exclamation mark again with a capital P at the beginning. And now let's log in with password 1 exclamation mark. Oh, the email needs to be confirmed as well. Well, let's go back again with our admin user and let this user in. Restricted, well, it's already enabled, but we also need to make the email confirmed. As administrators, we can just say that this user has a confirmed email, and that's it, even though the registration settings require an email confirmation. And we can see that this user now is not authorized. So we have seen how this authorization works, and we have seen it with a built-in content permission. This is the basic level stuff. In the next session, we'll see how to also create your own permissions and, well, authorize against them.